The Perverse Subject of Analysis, Thomas Ogden. Part 1. In this paper I suggest that the analysis of perversion necessarily involves the elaboration and analysis of a perverse transference-countertransference. Both analyst and analysand contribute to and participate in the perverse transference-countertransference, which intersubjective construction is powerfully shaped by the perverse structure of the patient's unconscious internal object world. In the fragment of an analysis that is presented, I illustrate the way in which the analyst makes use of his experience of the transference-countertransference in gaining understanding of the perverse scenario that the patient is utilizing as a form of psychic organization, defense, communication, and object-relatedness. I discuss the analyst's use of his own unobtrusive, mundane thoughts, feelings, fantasies, ruminations, sensations, and so on, in the service of understanding the perverse transference-countertransference, which understanding is utilized in the formulation of transference interpretations. The perversity of the transference-countertransference is viewed as deriving from the patient's defensive use of particular forms of sexualization as a way of protecting himself or herself against the experience of psychological deadness. Compulsive erotization is understood as representing a method of creating an illusory sense of vitality. The subversion of the recognition of the experience of psychological deadness is achieved in part through compulsively enlisting others in the enactment of exciting, erotized, and often dangerous substitutes for the experience of being alive. It is by now widely accepted that the analysis of perversion is not fundamentally a process of decoding and interpreting the unconscious fantasies, anxieties, and defenses that are enacted in the perverse patient's sexual activity. Instead, it has become increasingly recognized that the analysis of perversion centrally involves the understanding and interpretation of transference phenomena that are structured by the patient's perverse internal object world. Malcolm, 1970, Meltzer, 1973. I believe it is important that this evolving understanding be developed a step further. In my view, the analysis of perversion necessarily involves the analysis of the perverse transference-countertransference as it unfolds in the analytic relationship. In analyzing perversion, one cannot hope to understand what the patient is attempting to communicate without to some extent entering into the perverse scene that is being created in the transference-countertransference. As a result, an analyst attempting to write about the analysis of perversion must describe something of his own experience of the perverse transference-countertransference, otherwise, he must content himself with presenting a desiccated, detached, and ultimately false picture of the analysis that fails to capture the experience of the siren song of the perverse scene in which he has unwittingly participated. Point 1. In this paper, I will illustrate, through a detailed clinical discussion, the way in which a form of perversity of the transference-countertransference derives from a core experience of psychological deadness. The story of this form of perversion is the fantasied history of the stillbirth of the self resulting from an unconsciously fantasied empty parental intercourse. It is a story that cannot be told, i.e., experienced by the subject, since the subject, as stillborn infant, is dead and therefore the very act of telling, creating, a story is a lie, charade. Paradoxically, the lie and the recognition of its falsehood in the context of an analytic discourse is the only real locus of truth, the only experience that feels real to both analyst and analysand. The type of perverse process that will be discussed is understood as centrally involving the subversion of the recognition of the psychological death of the subject, and of the emptiness of the analytic discourse in which he or she is engaged, and the replacement of 1. The perverse intersubjective constructions generated in the course of the analysis of perversion are, in my experience, inevitably, to a considerable degree, inaccessible to the analyst's conscious awareness as they are unfolding. It is therefore necessary for the analyst to attempt to catch the drift of the patient's unconscious with his own unconscious. Freud, 1923, page 239. The analyst must in a sense come to understand the perverse transference-countertransference, after the fact, i.e., in the course of his doing the psychological work required to become aware of his own unconscious experience of and participation in the perverse transference-countertransference. This recognition with an illusory subject, the perverse subject of analysis. The perverse subject of analysis is the narrator of the erotized, but ultimately empty drama created on the analytic stage. The drama itself is designed to present the false impression that the narrator, the perverse subject, is alive in his or her power to excite. The perverse analytic scene and the perverse subject of analysis are jointly constructed by analyst and analysand for the purpose of evading the experience of psychological deadness and the recognition of the emptiness of the analytic discourse/intercourse. In a sense, the perverse subject of analysis constitutes a third analytic subject intersubjectively created by and experienced through the individual subjectivities of analyst and analysand in the context of their separate, but interrelated personality systems. Consequently, the jointly created intersubjective construction, the perverse subject, is experienced differently by analyst and analysand. In a recent series of publications, Ogden, 1992a, b, 1994a, b, c, d, 1995, I have discussed the concept of the intersubjective analytic third as well as specific forms of the intersubjective third, such as the subjugating third of projective identification, Ogden, 1994c, d. Perversion of the transference-countertransference occurs in all analyses to different degrees. For some patients, it is the dominant form of analytic interaction, eclipsing all other modes of defense and object-relatedness. For other patients, it is in ascendancy only in a specific phase or phases of analysis. For still other patients, perversity the transference-countertransference represents a background that presents itself primarily in the form of a well-disguised sexual excitement associated with unconscious efforts on the part of the patient to thwart the analysis in fundamental but difficult to recognize ways, e.g., the patient's unconscious excitement associated with his or her chronic inability/unwillingness to generate a single, original thought in the analysis, Ogden, 1994b. The understandings of perversion that will be discussed in the present paper rely heavily on ideas introduced by several analytic thinkers practicing in England and France. Kahn, 1979, has illuminated the way in which perversity represents a compulsively repeated effort to create experience that will disguise and partially substitute for the absence of a sense of being alive as a human being. McDougall, 1978, 1986, has discussed the need of the perverse patient to generate neosexualities in an effort to construct a self, albeit a self and a sexuality that is felt to be fragmentary, defensive, and unreal. Shasket, Smergel, 1984, has described the perverse patient as relying on omnipotent claims that there are no limits to what is possible sexually in an unconscious effort to shield himself from the frightening awareness of sexual and generational difference. Malcolm, 1970, has clinically illustrated the idea that the analysis of perversion is not a matter of the dissection of the symbolism of deviant sexual acts, but the analysis of the experience of the perversion of the transference as it evolves in the analytic relationship. See also, Meltzer, 1973. More recently, Joseph, 1994, has understood perverse sexual excitement in the analytic setting as a form of attack on the capacity of the analyst and analysand to think by means of a persistent sexualization of the transference and the act of thinking. My focus in the clinical discussion that will follow will be on technical problems presented by the perversion of analytic intersubjectivity itself. I shall discuss the challenge to the analyst posed by his attempt to derive understanding of the perverse analytic process from his experience within it while still maintaining his capacity to think and speak to himself about it, and eventually to discuss his understandings with the patient in the form of verbal interpretation. The clinical discussion will be followed by an effort to make a set of theoretical statements about aspects of the structure of perversion.